In this video, I will introduce you to the concept of inheritance. Inheritance is a fundamental concept in object-oriented programming that allows a class known as the derived class, subclass, or child class to inherit attributes and methods from another class known as the base class, superclass, or parent class. In Python, inheritance is achieved by specifying the base class as an argument to the derived class, and the derived class inherits all the attributes and methods of the base class, and it can also have its own attributes and methods. This allows you to reuse code and create a hierarchy of classes where each subclass can add new functionality. In Python, a derived class can inherit from a single class or multiple classes, and derived classes can also be base classes for other derived classes, allowing you to create multi-level inheritance. In my development environment, I have a dessert class that has the attributes name and flavor, and a cook method that outputs you bake the and then puts in the flavor and the name. The dessert class and any derived classes will be able to use this cook method. The derived class is going to be the cookie class. To create a derived class, you do it just like any other class. You start with the class keyword, and then you put in the name of the class. But instead of just putting a colon, we are going to put a pair of parentheses, and then inside the parentheses, we are going to put the name of the class that we are deriving from, which in this case is dessert. Then we do our colon, and underneath this, we can put in any attributes and methods. The cookie class is only going to have one method, and it's going to be dunk. So I'm going to define the dunk method and give it the self parameter. And the dunk method is simply going to print you dunk the and then put in the name of the object in milk. And now that I have my dessert and cookie classes, I will create objects for each of them. I will call the first one pie, which will be a dessert object. And I will give it the name pie and the flavor of apple. And for the cookie, I will simply call it cookie. And although I did not actually set up an initialization function in here to take any parameters, because the cookie class is derived from the dessert class, I have to pass in the same parameters as I would if I was creating a dessert object. So I'm going to give it the name cookie and the flavor chocolate chip. And I will demonstrate calling the methods on these objects. So the first thing I'll do is type pie.cook. And when I run this, we'll get the output, you bake the apple pie. And now if I do it on the cookie, we'll see that the cookie, which is derived from the dessert class, can call this cook method that's in the dessert class. And when I run this, it says you bake the chocolate chip cookie. Now, if I try to do something like pie.dunk, I will get an error. It says attribute error, dessert object has no attribute dunk. That is because the base class cannot see the attributes or methods that are in the derived classes. But if I did cookie.dunk, I will get the output, you dunk the cookie in milk. Let's say that we did want to add an attribute that is unique to the cookie class. We would have to use the init dunder method with the self parameter as well as parameters for the base class and the derived class. So under the cookie class declaration here, I am going to add the init dunder method, and I am going to pass in self for the self parameter, and then name, flavor, and price. And then I have to call the base class's init function explicitly and pass in the variables that it takes. So if I hover over this, it takes the self variable, the name variable, and the flavor variable. Now, because we are calling this explicitly, Python is not going to pass the instance into this method. So we have to do it by putting self right here, and then we would pass in the other required variables. And this name here is the same name that we are passing into our cookie class whenever we instantiate a cookie object. Same for flavor. And then under that, for the attributes that are going to be unique to the cookie class, that is where we would do our self dot notation for the attribute that we want to create in the cookie class, and then set it to the value that we want to set it to, whether it's some default value or a value that we passed in. So down here on my cookie, I will add the price, and I will make this chocolate chip cookie cost $4.99. I'm going to go ahead and remove these method calls here, and I will call the print function and tell it to print cookie.price, just so that we can see this, and this outputs $4.99. Another way that we could call the base class's initialization method here is, instead of actually using the class name, we can use super and a pair of parentheses, and then dot underscore underscore init underscore underscore, and then pass in our parameter. The super method allows us to call methods from within the base class. In this case, we are calling the init method. And the way the super method works, we don't actually have to pass in self, because the super method is allowing us to call methods in the base class from within the context of the derived class. So when we call it this way, it is going to pass in the instance of the derived class for us. And if I run this now, I'll get the output 499, everything works. And to further demonstrate the super method, I'm going to create another method inside the cookie class called bake and sell. And it is going to use the super method to call the base class's cook method from the context of the cookie object that is calling the bake and sell method. What this is going to do is it's going to call the cook method, and then it is going to say you sell the flavor, name, for, and then the price. I am going to change this here. I'm going to say tart equals, and I'm going to create a new cookie object. I'm still going to call it cookie, but its flavor is going to be cherry tart, and its price is going to be $6.99. And then down here, I am going to call tart.bakeandsell and cookie.bakeandsell. And when I run this, we'll see that I get the output. You bake the cherry tart cookie, you sell the cherry tart cookie for $6.99, you bake the chocolate chip cookie, and you sell the chocolate chip cookie for $4.99. And just to reiterate how this works, the bake and sell method in the cookie class calls super.cook, which invokes the cook method of the base class dessert. The super method ensures that the cook method is executed in the context of the cookie instance. So in this case, when tart calls it, tart is that cookie instance. And then when cookie calls it, cookie is that cookie's instance. So any attributes or instance variables defined in the cookie class are accessible. Understanding and working with inheritance at first can be a little tricky, so I urge you to practice. Try working with multiple inheritance where you derive a class from multiple base classes. Try working with multi-level inheritance where you derive a class from a base class and then derive another class from the previously derived class. And just work with it until you have a good understanding of how inheritance works.